The first seconds of the new year were celebrated in all countries of the world, but on the dark side, instead of the explosions of fireworks, the sounds of guns, missiles, and bombardments were echoing. Even in the first seconds of the new year, heavy clashes on the front lines of the Ukraine-Russia war continued at full speed. Let's take a look at what critical situations have been on the battlefield this week, without wasting any time. Yesterday, the Zaporizhzhia region was very active. Units of the Ukrainian armed forces carried out attacks against Russian military targets in this region. Ukrainian forces carried out striking operations in Berdyansk, Tokmak, and Melitopol in the Zaporizhzhia region, where the Russian troops were concentrated, and blew up 12 ammunition depots belonging to the Moscow army. The invading Russian troops, who were trying to establish a devil's triangle in these three cities, received a heavy blow after these attacks of Ukraine, and fled from the trenches and fortification points they were in. Also yesterday, the Moscow army lost more than 400 soldiers after the Ukrainian armed forces and artillery units destroyed the huge Russian military base in Makivka. Considering all these losses, Russia lost nearly 2,000 soldiers in just 2 days. While the Moscow army has made a very bad start to the new year, the Ukrainian forces have made good progress on the front lines by carrying out point shootings in recent days. The invading Russians were living hell in Ukraine. So what was the key to Ukraine's strategic and point-of-point attacks against the invading Russian troops? The answer to this question is actually quite simple. You may remember that before the new year, the Ukrainian Air Force targeted critical military bases on Russian soil with drones. Engels military air base in Saratov, the Russian military base in Ryazan, was attacked by the Ukrainian Air Force with UAVs. After these attacks, the Moscow administration thought that the Ukrainian forces would target the most critical cities of Russia in the coming days. The intelligence reports that emerged in this process also pointed out that the Ukrainian army could carry out airstrikes, especially against the capital Moscow and the historical capital St. Petersburg. With Russian media channels also talking a lot about the wide range and effective capabilities of Ukrainian drones, there has been a perception that Moscow and St. Petersburg could be the target of dangerous airstrikes in the future. The Russian administration, on the other hand, has deployed most of its army's air defense systems to positions close to the capital, Moscow, in order to minimize the possibility of an air attack on Moscow. In addition to protect and constantly monitor the Moscow and St. Petersburg airspace, the Russian authorities deployed about 2,000 personnel. This risky move by Russia has greatly reduced the security of the military space and resources of the Moscow army, which is normally on the Ukrainian front line, because the defense systems deployed in Moscow and St. Petersburg left the Russian soldiers on the battlefield vulnerable to attacks by Ukrainian forces. Ukraine, on the other hand, turned this move of the Russians into an advantage and carried out dozens of offensive operations. The front lines of the war right now have literally turned to hell this week, especially with the attacks carried out by the Ukrainian forces. The Russian positions were on fire because of recent rains of bombardment by the Kiev army. Over the past day, the Ukrainian defense forces repulsed the attacks of the invading troops near 13 settlements in the Donbas. In addition, the Ukrainian Air Force carried out 18 attacks against Russian positions and anti-aircraft defense systems, again on the Donbas front line. As a result of these attacks, dozens of Russian fortifications and ammunition depots were blown up. It was also claimed that dozens of Russian soldiers were injured. Already, the Moscow administration had transferred air defense systems to Russia to protect its territory. Thus, Donetsk and Luhansk have now become much more obvious targets. For this reason, the Ukrainian forces intensified their attacks on the invading troops. At this time, the counterattack of the Kiev army continues throughout the Donbas. After these latest attacks of Ukraine, the front lines have seriously turned into a fireplace. Despite 18 airstrikes by the Ukrainian Air Force on the Donbas front line, the invading Russian troops do not give up on reaching the administrative borders of the Donetsk region. Violating the norms of international humanitarian law, laws, and customs of war, the Russians continue to attack critical infrastructure and civilian settlements on the territory of Ukraine. Because the leader Vladimir Putin and the top military officials of the Russian army think that this is the only way they can stop this striking advance of the Kiev army. Over the past day, the Moscow army has carried out 6 missile strikes, 52 airstrikes, and 77 MLRS strikes along Ukraine's eastern and southern front lines. In addition to the 6 Russian missiles used in these attacks, 30 airstrikes targeted Ukrainian civilian infrastructures. In addition, all 27 Shahed 136 UAVs of the Moscow army were shot down by the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The Ukrainian General Staff stressed that the threat of Russian airstrikes and missile strikes on critical infrastructure facilities continues throughout the country. Yesterday, units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces near Stelmakivka, Makivka, Ploshchanka, and Bilohorivka in the Luhansk region. The Ukrainian army, which managed to prevent the attacks of the invading Russian troops, did not delay in responding to these pressures of the Moscow army. Ukrainian defenders shot down a Russian Ka-52 helicopter and 3 reconnaissance Orlan-10 UAVs a few days ago. These heavy losses of Moscow, on the other hand, brought up the problems experienced by the Russian troops regarding ammunition reserves. In addition, Russia lost 108,210 soldiers from February 24, 2022 to January 3, 2023, and 750 of these Russian soldiers were killed on January 2 alone. However, the Russian leader Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin administration, especially from the beginning of December until today, adopted a policy to increase their attacks on Ukrainian soil in order to hide the huge impact of these heavy losses of the Moscow army. Not wanting to show that it's in a weak position on the battlefield, Russia yesterday attacked the water area and coastal area of the Ochakiv community in the Mykolaiv region. The times of the attacks carried out by the Moscow army in the Ochakiv region were recorded at 10:34 a.m., 11:18, and 6:10 p.m. respectively. Fortunately, no casualties were reported at the scene after these attacks. In fact, at this time, the intensity of the war began to decrease considerably in the city of Mykolaiv and in the districts of Pervomaisk, Voznesensk, and Bashtanka. Since Russia tends to withdraw in these regions, there is no conflict in and around Mykolaiv at the moment. But the same cannot be said for Dnipropetrovsk. Russian invaders bombarded Nikopol and Pokrovsk settlements in the Dnipropetrovsk region at midnight last night. Both these two areas were attacked by Russian Grad systems and heavy artillery twice during the night. Russian forces fired more than 20 artillery rounds against the cities of Nikopol and Pokrovsk. In the districts close to these two cities, there was only one air raid alert, but fortunately there was no emergencies or casualties. At the moment, on the Dnipropetrovsk front line, there are still kamikaze drone attacks and artillery fire by the invading Russian troops. The Ukrainian Defense Forces, on the other hand, formed serious fortifications in the region and started counterattacks. In addition to Ukraine's superior position against the invaders in this war, the heavy bill of all these Russian attacks on civilian targets became clear this week. Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal stated that the damage caused by the war launched by Russia to the country's infrastructure exceeded $700 billion. Shmyhal also stated that the damage caused by the war to the environment is approximately $35.3 billion. Not only material damage, but hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in this war. Thousands of people's lives are still in danger in Ukraine due to the aggressive policies of the Russians. There is only one sentence in the language of these people, which is, "I want to live." Thank you for watching us.